continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and I can't imagine that anyone who has watched this program for very long, since it went on the air more than 45 years ago, has any question at all about my being a New Yorker. To be sure, The Open Mind is seen each week in many other places around the nation, at times outside of it too, and I teach in New Jersey, have worked in Georgia, lived as a boy in Arizona, and even commuted to Hollywood for 20 years. Yet I'm Manhattan-born and bound, and proud of it. And that's part of the reason I'm particularly pleased today that my guest is Mike Wallace, director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where, in fact, we record The Open Mind. For my guest won the Pulitzer Prize in 1999 as co-author of Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898, published by Oxford University Press, and is working by himself now on a second volume that will take the Big Apple through the 20th century. Of course, our town has perhaps never been besieged more than since terrorists' infamous attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. But I wonder if my guest doesn't find the historian's perspective to be something of a source of comfort and hope. Is that true?
Yes, I think so. One of the problems with not having a historical sensibility is that you're trapped in the present and you're prey to all kinds of anxieties because you think you're disconnected from time, and you're not really. History is alive, well, and working its way through the present. So that's one thing. It reminds us of continuities. And the other thing is it lends a sense of proportion. It's a bit hard because some people will say, well, who cares what happened in 1776? But you mentioned that, this is a particularly besieged place right now. Well, in 1776, it wasn't just besieged, it was invaded by the largest amphibious landing in the history of warfare up till that time. In the course of their invasion, the British managed to burn much of the city to the ground, and then 90% of the population fled, and the place was occupied for 7 years. Now that's investiture.
That's terror.
So, and we've had other remarkable jolts in our time. So, when people ask if this is the first day of the rest of our lives, if the whole world has changed, and you hear this a lot, I have to say, well, this is not to gainsay that this is a terrible, terrible blow, and we're going to have to work very, very hard to overcome it. But it also is a city that is 8 million strong. It has 400 years of history behind it, and something that colossal has an enormous amount of inertia. It just does not get knocked off its pins quite that quickly. And to the degree that a historical sensibility can restore that sense of perspective, then it's nice that historians have something to contribute, especially as few of us are terribly good at bucket brigades or lifting steel girders off of sites.
I was delighted when I discovered that you and I had studied with and under Richard Hofstadter. And I have to assume that we share a perspective, given the fact that he was such a determined and such a strong-minded historian. What is that perspective? I've been trying to figure it out.
Well, let's see. Dick was particularly interested in putting things together. And for me, that was the great inspiration. He took all of the range of possible kinds of discourses, intellectual history, cultural history, psychological, economic, political, as his purview. And better than that, he wove them together. And then also, second inspiration for me, made them accessible. He was a masterful writer. And he aimed at a general public. And I'm afraid that much of our discipline has lost its way, understandably to some degree. There are real hard theoretical labor that sometimes requires theoretical language to sort out. But, you know, history is a profession. There was a craft that was all about telling stories to a large-scale audience, and Dick did that, and very few others of his generation were as, you know, eloquent as he was. So I was inspired, I mean, quite literally, because the last project technically the last project he worked on was the book that he and I did together on the history of American violence that came out in 1970, but he had embarked already on what he projected to be an 18-year enterprise of 6 years each for 3 volumes of an entire history of the United States. And then, as you know, he died horribly young of leukemia before he'd barely gotten it off the ground. So I said to myself, then as a young graduate student, oh boy, if I'm ever going to do anything like this, if I'm ever going to try to get a grand synthesis and an overview of history, I'd better start now, because, you know, if I wait until I've done this monograph and that monograph and worked my way up, as is the tradition, I could get hit by a bus. So I did. Pretty soon after that, in the early 70s, I began working and got my colleague Ted Burroughs involved in what was going to be a 3-volume history of the United States. And it was going to be at the same level of analysis that Gotham was at. And it was going to be a story the same way, only in those days we were going to have it totally foolproof girded with footnotes. So it was going to be, you know, academic as well. So we worked on that for several years, and we had hundreds and hundreds of pages of manuscript, and we hadn't gotten out of the 17th century, because we were setting New York in a national and global context, which is, I think, the only way to tell its story. And then we realized this was going to take about 11 lifetimes. We only had 2 to spare. So after despairing for a while, we then decanted that enterprise into what, in our naivete, seemed like a more manageable enterprise, the history of New York City, but now in, again, a national and global context, all of that work wouldn't go to waste. So I like to think that Dick would have approved of this kind of combination of both synthesis of many areas of history and keeping an eye on a general audience.
In the years since I was a practicing historian, I've often had the opportunity or the responsibility for hiring people for, let's call them intellectual jobs, jobs where they had to use their minds. When I started Channel 13 in New York as the public television station, I avoided picking people who had studied media. And I very, very much focused on people who had studied history, because I think of it as the synthetic subject. Are you of the same mind?
Well, I am. One doesn't want to be parochial about this, and
Why not?
An anthropologist will stake claims. But I think that a lot of disciplines, what they're about is taking a slice in time. A sociologist studies the balance of social sectors, and cultural anthropologist looks at the range of dynamic cultures. But what they all do is in 2 dimensions for the most part. And the trick is, I think, to add in that dimension of time and to understand these same kinds of questions, but how, in fact, they change. And if you don't include the element of transformation, if you don't think about how you move from here to here, you can develop all too easily, in economics, for instance, a very static picture of how the economy works. So to the degree that historians do that, then I think they have a particularly important contribution to make.
The journalist and the historian, what's their connection?
Well, I was over at the Times for some reason a while ago, and they gave me a copy of Gotham and asked me to sign it. And I said, to the New York Times, where would historians be without it? And it's, there's a lot of truth in this notion that it's the first draft of things. You have to be very careful because, you can fall prey to the notion that if it's in the pages of the New York Times in 1894, it's gospel writ, which is nothing of the sort. Journalists have their filters, their, frames of analysis through which they see the world and don't see some things and see other things, and then there are constraints that publishers impose. But nonetheless, these are the people who are on the front lines, and they're, the best of them are the ones I find who think historically and who understand that what they're doing is they're capturing a moment of time, but to catch it in depth, they have to have some sense of what the forces were that moved into this moment and therefore are moving through it.
In terms of the journalists you read, you watch, do you think they have the sense of the responsibility of the historian? Should they?
Well, first, it's very difficult. I mean, for instance, right now, in the course of this current crisis, I've been asked a lot by various media people, and I've spent a lot of time helping them on background as well as, for quotation and such. And I think that's a responsibility, and I feel for them. The problem comes up, and they have to have a story by tomorrow, and they want some historical perspective. But, that's something that takes time. It's like any skills, like any craft, you have to spend time garnering that information. So I think a partnership between historians and journalists is something that should be more built in. I think if you had resident historians, for instance, at great newspapers and at major media outlets who were jack of all trades, who were connected to the profession so that they could say, I don't know the answer to that, but I can find somebody who does. Not for particular bits of information, but for context, for setting these events in, again, some kind of longer sweep of history. I don't think most journalists in the real world have time to do that, which is why I agree with you. That to the degree that you can find people who are trained in history, then you've got a leg up on that. So it's not easy. But I'm afraid also you're up against the culture of the profession, the media profession, which I have to confess I don't think pays sufficient attention to history, except for a few great institutions. The pressures of the immediate are simply too overwhelming.
Now, you mentioned before the prism through which the reporter reports, sees what he has to report, and then reports. The historian?
Oh, historians definitely have their own prisms. Historians, for instance, you can look at the history of the history profession like anything else. And if you do that, you see simply in the last 50 years, our era has witnessed a tremendous transformation, both in an expansion of the range of questions that people ask and an expansion in the subjects of history to which they pay attention. Let's remember that until 50 years ago, women were simply not in the equation. There was Betsy Ross sewing away in the textbook, nor were blacks, except for a few happy darkies and George Washington Carver. Now, it's not just that you suddenly discovered that you'd left out 60% of the population. You throw in the immigrants, whom you hadn't paid too much attention to. You'd only look really at statesmen, at generals, at legal profession, at bankers, and so forth, the people who unquestionably were very powerful. And shaping because they had that power. But there was a blind spot. It wasn't just that you left out cumulatively 90% of the population. It's that you don't just add them back in. In the beginning you did that. You added a few extra chapters on women, you added a few chapters on blacks, But then you realized that it puts different questions on the agenda. With women come the questions of consumption, of shopping, of gender relations, which in fact you now discover permeate even those guys up at the top. And the Teddy Roosevelt, there's a dimension that you can add to an analysis of his presidency if you realize that he's this ferocious macho guy who's got his own frames. So to the degree that history of media, the history of journalism, that wasn't on the agenda, except for a few little very narrow things on the history of journalism. So we've expanded the house of history, and I think that that's all to the good. I think it's one of the great accomplishments of our generation.
Do you think we've yet accomplished brought ourselves to the point where people read Gotham and know that is not history? That is Wallace's picture, view of what happened in the past, and that
Well,
history.
I sure hope so. I sure hope so. In fact, we said it, Ted and I, in the introduction. We said that all history is a construction, and that this particular story represents our selection of data and our take on how those various pieces of information fit together. It reflects our silences as well as our presence. So, yes, I think that's the case. And I think what you have to do is to be honest about that, to lay out a story, say, this is our take on it, and we're putting it on the table for your consideration. And also, it's very important, for the consideration of the profession. So the profession is a collective body that represents a check. If there's a checks and balances system in the intellectual world, it's in the world of the craft itself. So if you make things up, the cardinal rule, if you get things wrong in terms of dates, the Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 12th, and if you think it is, you've got a problem. So there's that kind of cross-checking thing. And then there's, to some degree, how it resonates with people. And, to that extent, our take of New York in this moment represents who we are, our experiences, the kind of questions we ask and are concerned about. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, they may well be asking very, very different kinds of questions.
Whatever your intentions, and however you and your partner phrased your warning, do you think most people understand it, take it to heart, either in print, history as print, or history as film or television?
Maybe film is, in fact, even easier for people to understand that it's a construction, because this is a generation that's very skilled in media analysis.
Oh, come on now. Do you think that Stone's JFK was understood as what you call construction?
I think, well, for one thing, there was a tremendous amount of discussion about it, and there's media commentaries on film, and people are attuned to that, and you get it even on your TV, little clips, the two guys with their thumbs up or down or whatever. There's a lot of discussion that people are used to in that field, whereas in history they're less prepared for it. And I think, and it's funny, Hofstadter had the same. He wasn't concerned about it, and I'm not really concerned about it either, because you can only do what you can do. But to the degree that you write well, to the degree that you present a plausible narrative, to the degree that you don't, and we had to make a decision about this. We had to make a decision in this book that we were not going to say, even in footnotes, well, here we're following Jones and we think Smith is just off the wall, and here our analysis borrows from X. That's an academic approach, and it's important in academia. Here, we just laid it out like a seamless narrative, and so it is true that to the degree that it's done well, and apparently people like this, then it's just like a good story, and it's got a compelling sense of truth. But I think if it doesn't resonate with people's own understanding of the way the world works, then there's a dissonance there.
Yes, but don't you help make that understanding of the way the world works?
Yes, and that's what critics do. That's how reality is constructed. I'm not large on a lot of what gets called postmodern stuff, but I think the common notion that they're saying that there's no absolutes is both right and wrong. I think in any field, in history, in art criticism, in anything, what you do is you've got a contention between different interpretations of beauty, of history, of truth. I don't think there is, in fact, an absolute that you can appeal to. Witness now, the president says this is good versus evil, but needless to say, there are millions of people who don't see it that way, or if they do, they flip the equation, and they say we're freedom fighters, we're not terrorists. But it is our responsibility to make the best case we can that says this is our conviction, and we have to act on it because we can't act on anybody else's. We can be aware that there are conflicting approaches.
Then why do you, in this wonderful little book of essays, Mickey Mouse History, why do you take after, let's say, Ronald Reagan when he becomes the historian as president?
Because that's our obligation. Our obligation is to say, you have laid out a narrative. You have laid out your understanding of what the history of the United States is all about, how, in fact, it shapes our range of choices in the present. If, in fact, I believe that the story that you've constructed is seriously skewed, it departs in too many places from contact points with reality that's easily provable. And in Reagan's case, that was particularly easy. He was out there in outer space.
No, he wasn't in outer space. He was in Hollywood.
Well, there
which
you
he
are.
knew.
Well, but did he know? I mean, this is the great question. I had a radio program, a series on radio in the 80s, in the early 80s, and one of the first shows that we did talked about, does Reagan really believe what he's saying, or is he just on some kind of cinematic autopilot? And it was very hard to distinguish between those things. Anybody who could, honestly believe that he liberated the concentration camps and so forth. So I think he's easy, but I think there are a lot of other people that aren't so easy, and that's a conflict. That's what life is about. It's a conflict to determine meaning, and to the degree that you can make a persuasive case and that people in fact support your approach to things, then you have a larger share in that population of defining the nature of reality and truth, for that matter.
Doesn't that tend to make people nervous when I quote Beard as saying that all recorded history is an act of faith? I can see my students certainly not resonating positively to that. What do you mean act of faith? It begins to become a little voodoo-ish.
Well, our generation wouldn't say faith, they'd say fiction. And the debate would be between whether or not history is in fact distinguishable from fiction. Because again, as you said, and I agree, it's largely a construction by the historian. It's the questions the historian asks, and it's the nature of the evidence that he or she assembles, and it's the way that's woven together to tell a story. However, one, you can't cheat. You can't make up facts. And two...
Who said?
That's the rules of the history game.
Not the rules of the journalist game, of the history game, right?
Of the history game. I mean, ideally, I can't speak for another craft here, ideally, it's the rules for the journalism game, too. I mean, if you make up facts, then you're going to be called into question by your peers. You're going to be known as a shoddy reporter. You blew the last 18 times. We don't listen to you on the 19th time.
But it's the way you stack up the facts, isn't it? It's the way you put something in front of them, behind them, the perspective that you take.
Absolutely. And there, if your facts are straight, you're less vulnerable. Now you're vulnerable only to disputations on the strength of your argument, the degree to which it's congruent with your listener's sense of the way reality works. So, I mean, I think that there are distinctions. I mean, I don't want to say that any historical analysis is good as any other. I don't believe that. But I have to, in the end, believe that the one that makes most sense to me is the one that I'm going to put my chips behind.
How do you feel, and I really mean feel, about faction, the mixture that is so common today of fact and fiction?
Well, it makes me nervous as a professional. It makes me nervous. It does make it hard for people to have a sense of any kind of solid ground. There's a blurring of things. It's fine as an entertainment form. I've got no problems with that as an entertainment form, as long as it's sort of properly labeled. And I don't think most people are that easily fooled. I'm not
You
sure.
said that to start with, and I guess going through the mass of Gotham and Mickey Mouse history, I don't agree with you. It's one big point where I don't agree with you. I think quite to the contrary. We are more easily fooled because we know less and less. There are fewer of those pegs upon which we can really hang our hats.
Well, I mean, I won't do serious battle with you on this. No, I mean, it's alarming to the degree that the database seems to be shrinking. On the other hand, you also have to keep that in perspective. If you asked 50 years ago what most Americans knew about their history, I suspect, and you gave them the kind of test that they give to people now, I suspect they would sort of fail miserably too. And that might not be
miserably? As miserably?
It wouldn't surprise me. And we, I mean, some of it is just, our age. I mean, we look back and these kids that I teach, I mean, Vietnam, they could be the Punic Wars as far as they're concerned. But they weren't alive then. So there's a fundamental divide between people who live through an experience, people who are in one generation contact so that their family, their members can tell them, they get a direct connection. But after that, you're on your own. And there, part of the problem is now that you have such a tremendous potpourri of sources of information. If anything, I mean, in the old days, you had a few textbooks that were cleared by the Texas State School Book Depository, and that's what you read, and you wrote it down. And now you're in internet land. You know, you can tap into a staggering array of information. I think that's the problem, and I think to the degree I don't know. I was talking with Max Frankel at the Times, he's a friend of ours, and he was saying that in the future of newspapers, future of news media is going to be the ability of some that have established credentials over time and have developed an audience to, in essence, certify things. And that there'll be a believability because something comes from this source that there won't be if you just pluck it off of the internet. Now, whether somebody who's now 10 years old is going to be able to make that kind of distinction, given the massive flood of data, I don't know. But I suspect that generation will work out filtering systems, critical faculties, critical facilities. You know, they may be MTV commentators or something like that. But I think every generation manages to do something. I'm a little optimistic.
I'm just going to say, where do you get your optimism?
Well, I guess from people that I meet. I guess from students. I mean, I may have a little unusual crowd at John Jay because there are a fair number of grown-ups in the classroom. But while many of them know very little in terms of an empirical data bank, they're street smart. You know, they've got some sense of how the world works now. And if you can take that kind of analytical reasoning and then show them how, in fact, you apply something like that in the past, you can get a grip on things, or you can get one that's satisfactory to you at least. It's not impossible.
I'll go along with that possibility and say it's impossible to continue because we've come to the end of our time.
Oh, my goodness, so soon. Oh,
and thanks so much for joining me today on The Open Mind, Mike Wallace. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to The Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.